So, I mean.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is Doug McCall from the International School Health Network. Pleased to welcome everybody to the regular open web meeting of the FRESH Partnership. I'm very pleased to be welcoming an excellent panel to our session today, to our roundtable discussion. You should see the names on the screen with Anna, David, Stuart, Connie, Tim, and Kate who are presenting. I'm a believer in informal sessions, so you can see their organizations and some of their qualifications online. The purpose of this session is to get to know more about the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, which is focused on inclusion, and then to have a discussion from our panel members about different approaches that have been successful in addressing different parts of inclusion or different aspects of exclusion. So we're really pleased to have a really excellent panel to join us. This is a web meeting that's sponsored by the FRESH Partnership, which is a coalition of human agencies and other organizations. And we're pleased to be having these sessions as part of our regular meetings. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Anna to begin her remarks. And just, Anna, if you just tell me when you're ready to move forward on the slides, we can move them forward. You should see your first slide now.
Okay. Hi everyone, very happy to be here with you today. I keep my video off, so can you hear me well? I hope so.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. So just to start, and very briefly, for those of you that are not familiar with the Global Education Monitoring Report, the Global Education Monitoring Report has the mandate from the international education community to monitor progress on education and on SDG 4 in the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And I'm here today to talk briefly about the main recommendation and some other complementary tools of the report. The report has been launched, the Global Education Monitoring Report 2020 on inclusion and education has been launched this summer at the end of June 2020, and it really calls for country to concentrate on those being left behind and widen the understanding of inclusive education to include all learners. Next slide, please. And in fact, all countries have committed to inclusive education when they signed up for SDG 4 to be achieved by 2030. And this really is something that we cannot afford to lose sight of. And even we can think that over time, the case for it has become stronger. And COVID-19 has not helped in this sense. The Global Education Monitoring Report, first of all, refers to inclusion as a process that embraces diversity. In this sense, the report interprets inclusion as something that is really needed to build a sense of belonging to achieve social cohesion. And all these actions, as the report shows, are rooted in the belief that every person has value and potential, and it is not about neither discriminating against nor rejecting anyone. By contrast, it is about adapting to learners and making accommodation, and not about learners adapting to the system. And we know that over time, the case for inclusion has been championed by those supporting the right of people with disability, who have ensured and really worked hard to guarantee the right to inclusive education in international laws. However, as the report clearly highlights, inclusion is not about one group. And in fact, the mindset and the mechanism that generate discrimination and rejection are the same for all those that are excluded. And every society needs to own up to their mechanism that they exclude. Next slide. The Global Education Monitoring Report 2020 shows that identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunities in many, many countries, and too much often. The report discusses inclusion, looking outside and inside the classroom and the schools. In fact, the discussion of inclusion has to start first of all from the 258 million of children, adolescents and youth that are really out of school. And for example, it looks at different people and groups that are at risk of exclusion. In 12 countries, children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely never to go to school than their peers. Adolescent refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school. And we also know that the world has set a target for all to complete secondary school by 2030. However, there are some that will never do so, and for example, in at least 20 countries, not a single poor rural woman does so. And among those that complete lower secondary school, the richest students are 2 times more likely to learn basic skills than the poorest. In addition, looking inside schools and classroom, stigma, stereotypes and discrimination mean millions more are alienated inside classroom and less likely to progress through education. For example, LGBTI students in the United States are 3 times more likely to stay home from school because of feeling unsafe. Or grade 4 students not learning in their own language are 34% less likely to learn basic reading skills. Next slide. COVID-19 has added further layers of complexity to this situation, deepening existing inequalities. And additionally, many online solutions that have been provided to learning continuity have been inspiring, but they offer only a partial substitute for the education experience. And the disadvantaged students, evidence showed that disadvantaged students have been the least likely to benefit because they lacked the right device, internet connection, or home environment. And teachers had lost contact between, even in high-income countries like France, we know that in the first weeks after the lockdown was announced, teachers had lost contact between 5 and 8% of students. And we know that in global terms, learning opportunities online have been the exception. Only 12% of households in the least developed countries have internet access at home, and low-tech solutions are not working either. Among the poorest households in Ethiopia, only 7% own a radio and none own a television. And for example, we have analyzed the data of the Global Coalition for Education made by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank. And the data show that 30% of low and lower middle income countries have taken no measure to support disadvantaged learners during the school lockdown. And for those hundreds of millions of students, we are talking here of hundreds of millions of students, learning stopped completely, and some may not go back to school if their family was plunged deeper into poverty. Next slides. One of the major recommendations of the report, which is really very important, is that the report calls on countries to widen the understanding of inclusive education to encompass all learners, regarding their ability, their identity, or background. However, the report shows that many governments do not base their laws and policies on this principle. In fact, the report has found that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but only 57 of definition cover multiple marginalized groups. Next, please. The The report provides a number of recommendations, and the first recommendation is about funding of education. And in fact, inclusion is not costly by definition, and the report highlights that there are simple gestures and ways to manage a classroom that really do not cost nothing and are the most valuable contribution to inclusion. But even in that case, efforts need to be made to ensure that we get equity and inclusion rights through funding. First, education ministries tend to allocate general funding equally to local authorities or schools. Second, education ministry need to think how not only their budget, but also the budget of other ministries can help target students and families that are really most in need. For example, we know that the social protection programs in Latin America have really been very helpful and have increased education attainments by up to 1.5 years. And the support from international donors is also critical to allow countries to build inclusive systems. The global education monitoring calculations in the new policy paper that has been released on education funding has shown that global aid is likely to decline by up to $2 billion from 2018 to 2022. As a result of the big global recession caused by COVID-19. And this really, and I like to highlight that, poses a serious threat to the recovery of education. In addition, costs that are related to COVID-19 school closure are expected to increase the annual funding gap by a third. And this means that the education budgets must be at the very least maintained, if not increased, with more flexibility in funding so that existing support can be realigned. And this is also to say that acting now with immediate remedial programs, helping children to re-enroll and catch up, could reduce the additional costs that are related to COVID by 75%. The report has other recommendations for governments that are really meant to help them to address the challenge of creating and fostering inclusive education. The second one in this list is share expertise and resources, which is, and the report shows it, the only way to the transition to inclusion. In fact, too much often, resources and expertise have been concentrated in a few places and are still too unequally distributed. The countries that are making huge progress in inclusive education are those that are sharing expertise and resource, for example, setting up resource centers or collaboration between teachers in special school and mainstream school. The report also calls for meaningful consultation with communities, parents, and students, and school and government should really invite parents and community to voice their concern and treat them as equals in the design of policies and programs on inclusion in education. The report also calls for a closer cooperation across government departments, implying multi-sectoral cooperation and with tiers, so that there are integrated services that may help and should help addressing the diverse and multiple needs of learners. Next, please. But the report goes beyond that. It also calls for cooperation to extend to non-government actors who are critical actors in achieving inclusion. In fact, the governments should make space for non-government actors to challenge and fill the gaps, while making sure that they are working towards the same goal of inclusion. Another recommendation concerns universal design that is crucial for fulfilling each learner's potential, but not just in terms of infrastructure, but also curricula and textbook. This is the UGL. And the fact is that the report highlights that all students should learn from the same flexible, relevant, and accessible curriculum that recognize diversity and respond to various learners' needs. They should not learn from reduced curricula or that segregate them even more. And then the report moves to a very important recommendation that concerns the education workforce and teachers in particular. In this respect, I should say that we will be launching a new policy paper on teacher training on inclusion next week on the World Teacher Days, the 5th of October, which deepen the understanding on teacher training, teacher needs training on inclusion. In fact, the education workforce should be prepared to teach all students, and it is necessary to respond to their needs of being trained, which is a concern for many. And lastly, the report calls for countries to collect data on and for inclusion with attention and respect, meaning that the collection of data should not increase or push for more stigmatization or stereotypes and labeling. What data are collected and how they are used determine really whether inclusion is served. Next slide, please. Alongside the report, we have also launched a new website, the PEER, that is about a profile of educations, and you can see the website address that is on the screen. And PEER form a triad with two other websites, WIDE, that is on education inequalities, and SCOPE, which uses data visualization to compare trends over time and patterns across countries on SDG 4, but also building some very useful and insightful narratives. I will focus on PEER in this last part of my presentation to you today. And next slides, please. So the PEER website, as I was saying, includes profiles that describe how every country, including yours that you are listening today, approaches inclusion in education through its law and policies. And it is really meant to be a companion of the Global Education Monitoring Report of this year on the theme of inclusion, but it will be also updated each year according to the theme of the report. So the next profiles that will be launched in January 2021 will be on financing, and then they will be followed by the non-state actors profiles that, in fact, the next report, 2021, the theme of the next report 2021 will be on non-state actors in education. If you go on the top of the slide, you can see that there is a button that allows to launch a little animation that allows you to see how this website looks like, and how this can really help to understand the different approaches to inclusion that have been adopted by other countries. We have analyzed the PEER, these profiles for the Global Education Monitoring Report, but also for a background paper that is indicated in the same screen that you are showing. And for example, as I was saying before, from the analysis of laws and policies and the mapping of the qualitative information that we have collected from about 168 countries, we know that 68% of countries have a definition of inclusive education, but 82% of countries still have a definition of special education needs. And many policy and plans promote inclusive education. In many countries, the laws and education acts really still dictates the person with disability need to be educated in separate settings such as special school. So if you look inside the report or in this background paper, we have analyzed the education provision for people with disabilities. And even if there are many countries that combine different approaches, segregation is still very, very widespread, though there are differences across regions. And the widening of the understanding of inclusive education is really, as something that concerns all learners, is really still too rare. Just 19 countries out of 195 that we have mapped in this respect have adopted a comprehensive inclusion concept in their educational laws. And in fact, progress towards inclusive education is hampered by incoherent legislation and policies, but also by a lack of implementation. So even where there is the commitment to inclusive education in laws and policies, the issue is that rarely the practice follow. So this is really the messages, some of the messages that I would like to disseminate from the report, and I hope you will help us to disseminate this report. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was an excellent overview of the report. I'm going to, we've had some technical problems with two of our speakers. We did do test drives before this meeting and they worked, but they don't seem to be working this morning or this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Stuart if you, which should be next in line. I'm getting some, I think I'm going to skip through there's a couple more slides, Anna, that were part of your presentation, which I'm just going to skip through.
I went through them. Through them in talking. So
okay. Sorry.
Okay. No worry, because it was related to peer. So yeah. I was talking about the mapping of the results. So you are in the almost the last slides, and the last one is just help us to disseminate the main message that is all means all, and is really the ambition of the full inclusion.
Great. Thank you, Anna. That's good. Stuart, if you'd like to jump in here and with your remarks and a little bit about GPE and your approach to inclusive education.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Doug and Anna. Very good to see the presentation of the GEM report again. We've been very excited to see this GEM report coming out and also as sort of seemingly part of a larger movement towards highlighting these issues around inclusive education and disability inclusion in particular that's been happening especially since the Global Disability Summit in 2018, raising the prominence of these issues. At GPE, we very much agree with the definition of inclusive education as being about all children and leaving no one behind. But we also are aware, of course, that children with disabilities remain a particularly marginalized group and one that is not sufficiently recognized in the policy discussions and in the implementation of policy, and that the challenges to that implementation have not yet been addressed. So we're very happy to see all of that very clearly recognized in the GEM report. You know, the report highlights as well that countries still have a long way to go in moving towards an inclusive approach for children with disabilities, as well as on a wider range of inclusion issues. You know, one point that Anna made in particular was interesting, which is about the policies often being incoherent, or even where there are some coherent policies that you have a lack of implementation. And I think what we've seen with GPE and its partner countries, that many countries have planned, they address inclusive education in their sector planning, but often they're kind of not committing to any immediate activity. They're planning things like doing a study at some point or having a separate policy on inclusive education, which will come out later on and possibly not be coherent with the rest of their policy, or at least not be mainstreamed across the rest of their policy, which is really kind of delaying any concrete action to address the issues which are already recognized. And just to say as well that the peer resource is looking enormously useful for GPE to understand the status of our partner countries quickly when it comes to their planning and policy on inclusive education and their rights frameworks. All of this can be brought into our discussions with country partners. So I'm just going to present a little bit of background on GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, for those who may not be so familiar with it. GPE is a partnership and fund dedicated to education in lower income countries. Our vision is a quality education for every child, leaving no child behind. And our main way of operating is through working with governments to develop education sector plans and fund the implementation of priority activities. So the idea here is that it's a country-led approach where governments, together with their development partners, are developing analyses of their education sectors and education sector plan documents, using that to guide the selection of priority areas, which they can then apply to the GPE fund for grants for implementation. So the aim of the GPE grants is very much about addressing these implementation bottlenecks where the plans and the policy may already be in place, but nothing is really happening yet. And with our current sort of strategy process of trying to renew our strategy for the next 5 or 10 years, we're very focused on trying to understand how to better address these bottlenecks, these key bottlenecks in meeting the needs of marginalized groups and ensuring that all are included. GP works on disability inclusion through a number of specific mechanisms. One of them is having a results-based component in our grants. So part of the grant will be paid on condition of meeting criteria, which are decided by the government and its development partners together and GPE, which might mean, for example, setting up a system of school grants which can help schools to meet the needs of children with disabilities. We also have a funding stream called Education Out Loud, which is funding civil society and advocacy organizations to strengthen inclusive education in the sector policy dialogue. So countries have these groups, which we call local education groups, where they have this conversation around policy and planning. We want to improve and support the participation of civil society organizations in these groups and their ability to highlight issues surrounding marginalized groups, including children with disabilities.
Yeah.
We are supporting improvements on data on disability in particular, working with UNESCO Institute for Statistics and other organizations.
I responded, though. You didn't see my response?
Sorry, can you just hold, please? I think, please, participants, please click off your mics. We have some background noise from Stuart, so it's interfering with Stuart's presentation. So if you could just make sure your mic is off, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Who's talking? No, we don't have tax clearance. I've written them to say that we don't have tax clearance, and the reason why we don't have the tax clearance. So they should go ahead and send it and make a decision. There's no way.
Please, colleagues, please turn off your mic if you've got it on.
He's not paying. He said he's going to send a receipt today.
Khalifa, please turn off your mic.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, Stuart, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Okay, so GP also responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with an accelerated funding stream. We set up a window for countries to apply for rapid grants, both for the mitigation and the recovery phases, that is for mitigating the impact of COVID-19 and school closures on children's education through things like distance learning, but also for the recovery phase, so thinking about things like catch-up learning for when children return to school. Also, many of the funds have a kind of school health component, improving sanitation and hygiene in schools and other school health interventions. As part of this funding window, it was a criteria that countries should have some kind of plan for meeting the needs of marginalized groups. And as an example, if a country is planning a radio intervention, they also include a component of the grant which is specifically targeting children with hearing impairments, so that those children are not left out. Those children with hearing impairments could be reached through other interventions, such as using tablets or through other community-led approaches. The COVID-19 response has endeavored to ensure that these responses, like distance learning, are inclusive in how they work. Of course, this is quite a complex area to ensure that those responses are completely inclusive, and it will remain to be seen afterwards. And we have some research that is being funded from GP as well to look at how this COVID response met the needs of all children, including marginalized groups, in practice. So sometime down the line, we will be able to have a better understanding of whether all of those groups have been met and which groups have been left behind. So as part of, in particular, of GP's Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, we are establishing an observatory on COVID-19 responses in Africa, and that focuses, as I said, on gender equity and inclusion in those COVID-19 responses. And we're also working with UNESCO, UNICEF, and World Bank through an accelerated grant on global and regional learning, basically helping countries to learn from each other in terms of their COVID mitigation and recovery responses. So that's I'll stop there, but just to reiterate, it's been extremely helpful. The GEM report has been extremely helpful for reinforcing and helping to build the evidence base for GP's work on this area of inclusive education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I'm going to ask David if you could click on your mic and try to say hello. I'm worried that the technical problems we experienced earlier in the week, or earlier last week, are still with us. But if you could just click and say hello and try to say hello. Otherwise, we'll go to Connie for the next presentation.
Okay. Hi, Doug. Yes, I finally got on.
Oh, great. Okay. So we'll, David Osher from the American Institute for Research, and also one of the evaluators of the UNICEF Child Friendly Program, Child Friendly Schools Program. David, please jump right in.
Okay, let me just be very brief, and I will follow up with something. Apologies to everybody else. I think that the real implications of the GEM report to me is the fact that it's raised issues with clarity and demonstratively that we've known for a very, very long time, and are actually ones that are baked into the modeling of child-friendly schools. We did an evaluation of child-friendly schools globally in 2008, basically with an underlying model that if one wanted to enable young people to really learn, one had to do three big things. One had to really provide holistic supports to them, to use child-centered approaches to teaching, and to ensure that the community and families were actively engaged in that youth had a voice. One of the key elements of child-friendly schools, and it's one of the ones that was not successfully realized by UNICEF in 2008, was the issue of inclusivity, particularly inclusivity for young people with disabilities. That UNICEF has taken a whole set of steps since then to start to move forward that I think that if one were to go back now, we would see differences. At the same time, I think that one of the challenges, not of the UNICEF model, but of the UNICEF implementation process, is that it does not, there aren't resources to permit the level of ongoing focus that is necessary to markedly transform systems, which no matter what take 5 to 10 years at best, because everyone has to really be changing the ways in which they operate. And that includes the ways in one integrates the different types of approaches that are being discussed on this webinar today. They are doable enterprises. I'm happy to share others' information later, but having not been able to hear everybody else, I don't want to take more time now, other than ending by saying what we knew before COVID was that there were both profound inequities, and also that if you really want to enable young people to learn, it's really important to be in an integrated way addressing their social, emotional, and cognitive needs, and to do it in a way that supports and enables teachers to be able to connect with them. That was important before COVID-19. It is even more important now. So let me end there, Doug, so I don't take any more time right now, and I'll be happy to do a follow-up that focuses in on what other people have said.
Thank you, David. And those are really pertinent remarks, and you're starting to move us towards the discussion, which we'll have at the end of the presentations. And your points are very well taken. In fact, maybe I'll just pause for a moment and indicate that the speakers we invited to the panel, there could have been others, but what we're trying to do, and as David is indicating, is trying to look at how does a country or a state work towards more inclusion. And one of the ways, at least in our work through the FRESH Partnership and through the FRESH Working Group, was to look at models of frameworks of how to organize interventions in a way that does that comprehensively and systematically. And so the child-friendly schools model, which really seeks out children, is one of them. And the work that GBE does is really intensive in the low-resource countries, and has, again, a systematic approach to doing it. So really pleased to be starting to move into the discussion phase, and ask Connie from Inclusion International to join in. And Connie wanted to turn on her video, so please do so. And I think everybody now is working at home with lots of bandwidth, so this is great. Connie, just jump right in.
Hi, everyone. Doug, I don't know. I'm just going to ask you instead of the whole group. Can you see my screen? Can you see my face?
Yes.
Okay.
That's great.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick introduction. I'm Connie Lauren Bowie. I'm the Executive Director of Inclusion International. Some of you will know us. We are the international organization of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. We were active in the negotiations of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and particularly played a leadership role in Article 24, inclusive education. And I will just say that as an organization globally, our member organizations in countries around the world we're celebrating our 60th anniversary as a global network this year. Our members came together in their own countries and as a part of Inclusion International, primarily because their children were being denied access to school. So 60 years ago, one of the very reasons for our existence came about because families were fighting for inclusion. That, I would say, is still true. Our members tell us in countries, low income, high income, and everything in between, that the major battle they face in their lives is getting access or getting inclusive education for their children. I should also say that Inclusion International is a member of the International Disability Alliance, and so we work very closely with our colleagues across all disability groups. During the negotiations of the convention, and particularly around Article 24, what became really apparent to us at Inclusion International is that the challenges faced by other disability groups in terms of education were very much about accessibility, about access, about disability supports. What we realized is that for people and children with intellectual disabilities, the access and accommodation requirements for children to be able to go to school was only one very small part of the challenge for us. That inclusive education for children with intellectual disabilities had to go much further than building the ramp or providing an accommodation in the classroom related to disability. And so right from the beginning, in the description of what was needed in a human rights framework, we were focused on system level change, making sure that when education systems were inclusive, they were inclusive of all learners, and that classrooms and learning modalities were effective for all different kinds of learners. We continue to advocate both at a country level and globally to bring forward that perspective. The general comment that was made by the UN expert, CRPD expert committee, reinforces that model of inclusive education, that while accommodations are an important human right, that does not go far enough in terms of system level reform for inclusive education. Where we see ourselves at the moment is that while governments have adopted notions of inclusive education, they continue to, there's still a paradox in the way that they see inclusive education, particularly around disability. And so what we've seen, and I will often say this to my colleagues, be careful what you wish for. So what we've seen is an increased investment and attention. Someone, one of the previous speakers mentioned the global summit hosted by the UK government, I guess that's 2 years ago now, highlighting this issue of inclusive education. The result has been, in fact, that many governments are paying attention and many funders are thinking about investing in inclusive education. However, what we've seen is that, for example, in the recent couple of years ago now, the stock take that GPE did showed that a lot of those investments at a country level are disability-specific interventions, and they tend to reinforce probably unintentionally segregated environments. We did some work with the World Bank recently, and I mentioned to Doug that one of the resources I thought would be helpful for this group is the recently released World Bank report called Every Learner Matters, unpacking the global learning crisis for children with disabilities. The reason I mentioned the paper is because we, working with the World Bank and other colleagues at Leonard Cheshire, dug a little bit deeper into this idea that getting in the door is the objective of inclusive education. In fact, we know that unless we actually look at learning outcomes for children across the board, that we won't be able to really transform systems. If it's only about getting in and it's not about actually having effective education, then we're really still stuck in the first model. The GEM report for us at Inclusion International is a huge opportunity and a really welcome reframing of what inclusive education should be about. Unless we can broaden the vision for inclusive education and strengthen the vision of inclusive education and reject the idea that it's only about making accommodations for different learners, I think we won't be able to move to the next level, which we are working on. I will just stop with a little advertisement for our own work at Inclusion International. One of the things our members have said to us in different parts of the world is we value the having a network that can have a voice at the UN level, but what we also need is tools and resources to help us work with our governments to reframe what inclusive education is and to help education systems transform themselves in country. To do that, we've established at Inclusion a platform called the Catalyst for Inclusive Education. And I will give a shout out to my colleague, Kate, who I think is up next, Kate Lapham from OSF, who supported us in establishing this platform. The purpose of the platform really is to bring sort of knowledge about inclusive education into the hands of community, civil society, and advocacy organizations in country so that they can help transform the way that children are included. And we see the GEM report almost as the basis for that work going forward. It really provides us with some really strong evidence and tools to be building a vision and equipping people to make systems level change in their countries. So thank you for this opportunity, Doug, and really happy to be on the call with other colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Connie. Looking forward to the conversation. I'm just going to skip through the slides. Tim Lewis and I from the University of Missouri, who's also co-chair of the Center on Positive Behavioral Intervention and Support, which is based in the U.S. but has taken on an international approach. Tim and I have learned the hard way that systems can change too. We did a good test run last week, and it worked fine. And in the meantime, his IT center has decided that they're going to favor Microsoft Teams rather than the Microsoft version of Skype for Business. So he was not able to join us this morning or this afternoon. I will post the slides and actually go to both him and David to do kind of an interview and post them on the Fresh web page, along with the reference that Connie made to another report, and be happy to add any that you think are useful, and I'll include them in that session description on the Fresh website. So the different approaches that we're having discussions about today, the GPE work in low resource countries, the PBIS approach has been primarily used in higher resource countries around the world, but is a very, again, well-developed approach, and you should take a chance to look through their website. It's an amazing amount of resources as well that are available there. And of course, going to the Connie's work, it's a student disabilities or students with disabilities is something that all countries are trying to promote. So I'm just going through Tim's slides now. You can see it's a very well developed framework, and their approach is really to look at trying to prevent students from dropping out of school, and so for a number of different reasons presented there, and they track the students around, and they you can see the countries that they support, and they really wrap around services so that those students get support rather than drop out of school. And so I'm going to Kate now, and Kate, if you wanted to just jump in and add your comments, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. If we can have the next slide, I can quickly talk to you about the ways in which the Open Society Foundation has addressed inclusive education. For us, inclusion is fundamentally about all learners in the system being able to study together, to play together, to become participants in their community together. And we do this for two reasons. First, we believe that the best litmus test of the strength of an education system is its ability to serve those learners who are most likely to be excluded. Sometimes that is learners with disabilities, particularly learners with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes it's learners of particular races or ethnic groups. But if an education system is doing well by those learners, chances are they're doing well by everyone. And this is the second reason, that inclusive education strengthens the way that we interact with each other through education to the benefit of everyone. So next slide. The elements of inclusive education that in particular, and I think maybe there's a little bit of background noise, if I can ask those who aren't speaking.
Yes, please, folks, please turn off your microphone so there's no background noise.
So the particular elements of inclusive education that we have supported have been grants to teachers and education staff members, particularly for the sharing of experience and networking, because we would rather advocate through positive example and to give people a platform to demonstrate that inclusive education is possible in their country, in their circumstances, within their policy framework, and to share information about how. We have provided direct support to governments and also to civil society organizations advocating for inclusive education policies, or to strengthen health, education, and social welfare policies, as well as to hold governments accountable for the moments when the policy falls short of the rhetoric and the implementation falls short of the policy. We have advocated for appropriate and sufficient funding for education, and I think this one is particularly important in the COVID-19 context, because we are all aware that deep cuts to education have either already happened or are coming in the budgets of many of the places where we work. And we know from 2008, we know from 1997, it takes at least 10 years for budgets in education and other essential services to recover. And when they do, their structure is often altered in a way that further privileges the elite and further marginalizes the vulnerable. And finally, we've offered support for inclusive curriculum, because we believe that part of inclusive education is seeing yourself and seeing the contribution of your community and people who look like you and sound like you within your curriculum in school. And we have supported parental involvement at the very high level that Inclusion International provides, and I think Connie gave a great presentation of that, but also at the sort of individual school level for parents to really understand and be involved in the governance of education. And finally, we have begun programs to advocate very strongly for student and learner voice in inclusive education, that students have decision-making roles in education governance, that they are meaningful participants in their class and their classroom, and that they have individual agency in the decisions that affect them, making real within education the nothing about us without us slogan that was so famous in the civil rights movement for people with disabilities. Next slide. So one of the things that I really like about the GEM report is the way in which it dispels some of the myths around inclusive education, or pushes back against what can be inappropriate uses of the rhetoric of inclusive education for other goals, right? So the idea that inclusive education comes from the North and the West, there are roots of inclusive education theory, certainly in the global North and in the West, and that continues in academia. But truly inclusive education meets learners, schools, and education systems where they are and helps them to advance in a positive and relevant way. Inclusive education is not another name for special education. It's not only about children with disabilities, it's about all the learners in the system. And in particular, we have done a great deal to examine the intersection between racial discrimination, disproportionate assignment of learning disability or disproportionate assessment with learning disability, and the disproportionate ways that school discipline is used both against kids with disabilities and against kids with from ethnic and racial minorities. Ironically, inclusive education can be seen simultaneously as too expensive and a cost-cutting measure, which I believe is probably unique in the education field in terms of criticism. If you have residential institutions, yes, closing them will decrease what you're spending on education, but that's not the reason you should be closing them. You should be closing them because they violate human rights. And similarly, inclusive education is a human right. It's not an expensive nice to have. It's not something that you do after you've solved every other possible problem in your education system. And finally, it's not a zero-sum game, right? So the idea that inclusive education takes away from my child to give to someone else's child, or advantages a particular group of learners is the sum opposite of the way that we would characterize inclusive education. Next slide. And so I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about what I see as some of the next challenges for inclusive education as a field, and to hopefully hear in the discussion what others think about this. I mean, as a field, we have intellectually and in terms of policy and in terms of certainly the really strong general comment to Article 24 of the CRPD, I think we have illuminated a lot of the technical and budgetary and pedagogical issues of inclusive education. But the two things that really complicate the situation and create the next crisis, I think, are the COVID-19 pandemic, the ways in which, as we've heard, we expect as many as 225 million learners to be pushed out of education completely as a result. And these will inevitably be the learners who are closest to the edge of the education system already, because our pandemic has simply highlighted the deep inequities and the fissures that already existed within our education systems and made them worse. And so those children who don't get pushed out will come back to schools and kindergartens and universities with significant learning gaps, having experienced the trauma of COVID-19 within their communities, and for us as well as educators. You know, we are also, at least in my organization, losing colleagues and losing partners and friends to this pandemic. And the second, I would be remiss to not bring up the climate crisis and the effects that this will have, I think, on the structure and the delivery of education. As we experience displacement and huge demographic shifts, the ways in which we deliver education, the ways in which we decide that someone is a displaced person or a refugee or an asylum seeker or an economic migrant or simply a disadvantaged learner, I think will have to change and evolve. And the idea that you begin school with your same aged cohort in a single community and you finish school with that same aged cohort in that community will not be the education model of the 21st century. And so that will mean that we need to be flexible and creative and resilient in thinking through how we plan the education policies of the 21st century, how we fund them, and how we recruit and train our teachers and other educators. So those are the things that are on my mind this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. And I really look forward to the conversation. Doug, thanks so much for inviting me.
Great. Thank you very much. Tim, I see that you're online. Can you click on your mic and see if we have sound?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So I'm just going to go back to your slides, and I don't know if you were online when when I skimmed through them very quickly, but please jump in. And we are a little pressed for time because of the technical problems, but please give us an overview of the PBS program and how it works. Thanks, Tim.
Sure, no problem. And again, apologies. Went round and round and round and finally found from our IT, oh no, the university no longer supports Skype for Business. So I apologize. Very, very quickly, you can find lots of information about our center at our website, pbis.org. If you click to the next slide, Doug. In essence, what we have done is gotten away from programs, packages, curriculum, and in essence, work with school teams and or district teams and or state teams and or national teams to help them address the unique challenges that each face. And so this figure really sort of sums up what we do in our center. We teach educators to look at data, unique data local to them, contextualize, culturalize, et cetera, Those data then guide and drive what practices they select. So typically the response to academic and or social, emotional, behavioral challenges is what's the latest, greatest, what program or package do we buy? And we really discourage that, and we teach educators to look at their data, pair practices that will in essence address their unique challenges, and then use data to carefully progress monitor and make decisions. And then the third piece, probably the most critical, the most essential, is how do we support the adults who we're now asking to put practices in place they probably weren't trained or prepared to deliver. So even though this is all about supporting preschool through year 12 students, most of our effort, energy go to the adults in that school, in that building. and give them the tools, the resources, the confidence, the strategies to implement evidence-based practices. The next slide sort of talks about, and again, we didn't invent this, we borrowed this from public health, this notion of a continuum, making sure we've got good universal supports. So as the theme here is looking at inclusion, the way we include high-risk kids, the way we include children and youth with disabilities is to create predictable, supportive, instructive environments, and then differentiate that environment based on their needs. And so what we do is, again, we work with educators to differentiate through Tier 2 supports all the way up to Tier 3 supports, those more individual intensive. Key through all of these is that they're linked. They're all grounded and based in universals. So everywhere that child goes, again, whether they're already identified with a disability or high risk, adults are behaving and interacting in positive, key to that, specific ways. Another key feature is when we work on the behavioral side, we ask educators, what are your challenges? What are your problems? And for every challenge, tell us what you want kids to do instead. And you can't say stop or don't. So we build systems to develop appropriate social, emotional, behavioral skills, not simply just trying to reduce them. If you skip ahead to the next slide, and we'll pass that slide. And one of the reasons that we've been so successful, so we've been contingently funded for 22 years now through our U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, is that, as I said, we've developed a framework, not a package or program. And so we've got lots of evidence, lots of research to show that it can impact both academic and social behavior. It's scalable across schools, districts, states, and nations. And it's implementable across a wide range. So we are in preschools, we are in typical public schools, we are in juvenile correction facilities, we are in self-contained special ed settings. So the logic of the framework travels well across a wide range of diverse contexts, and it's sustainable. We know the essential key features. We know schools, districts, states, nations can implement and can sustain the impact of those key features. If you skip to the next, this has kind of been our expanded focus. Oops, sorry. Go back one more. Sorry, Doug. Over the past 20 years, we started with a focus on students with disabilities. We've since been tasked to look at the cultural impact, trying to reduce dropout, improve school climate, integrating mental health within schools. We have lots of materials on our website around that integrated framework. As I said, kind of looking at alternative settings, and most recently, even the impact of the opioid crisis. We have several documents on our website that address the current COVID challenges that schools are facing. We've got online modules, we've got materials, we've got adaptations of a lot of the things we do. The next slide just shows you a representation of the number of countries that we also are currently working in. So not just simply have gone and done a presentation, but actively working with their ministries or Department of Education across several of these countries. And then the last slide, again, is our website, pbis.org, lots of information. In addition, there's the Association of Positive Behavior Support, and there are several international links to that. There's a Euro PBS, there's an Australia PBS, and several other nations are also starting to form chapters of that larger organization that is absolutely linked and related to a lot of those essential features within our center. So that's it in a nutshell. Again, I apologize for the technology glitches, but thanks for inviting me, and hopefully you will follow up and hit our website. Lots of great information there. More things you can ever read in a lifetime.
Great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to our speakers for persevering through the first of all, the human error and then the technical difficulties I think we've all overcome. So I'd like to open it up to discussion from everybody. This is an informal discussion, so please just open up your mic and jump right in. And the broad question is, where should we go from here? I think the presentation from UNESCO has given us the principles and the wide frame, as have a couple of other presentations about that. And a lot of people have talked about systems approach and about working through incremental change. Is there anything that can be done by UN agencies or by a coalition of groups who want to work together more often that would like to jump in? And we'll be happy. The Fresh Partnership is really a coalition it's only very limited resource, but if the Fresh Partnership can facilitate the start of an ongoing discussion, we'd be happy to see that done, hoping that other organizations would take the lead. Fresh Partnership is really a collection of partners, it's not an organization. So please jump in with comments about where countries or the global organizations or the global community should be going to next. Just click on your mic and jump right in.
Okay. Doug, may I come in?
Yes,
David?
go ahead, David. Yeah.
Okay. That I am not here representing UNICEF, and I am not somebody who likes pushing any particular model. I think it's really important to figure out how one implements and realizes the particular principles on the ground in different contexts. That being said, since I was asked to talk about the UNICEF model, let me just add the Child Friendly Schools model a little more about how I have seen that be adapted so that it really starts to address the things that I've heard the last set of speakers, including Tim, talk about when I was finally on. And that is that UNICEF in China took the Child Friendly Schools model, took the instruments that we had developed in 2008 to understand how young people experience child friendliness, as well as how teachers experience their capacity to support child friendliness, and then ended up, among other things, developing tools for schools on the ground to assess how they were doing in a cohesive way that address social, emotional, and cognitive factors, and at the same time addressing the issues of health and wellness. And I won't take time now. When we do the follow-up, we will. But I think what they were able to do was to start aligning this work on the ground in ways that are really important. I think as well, I will provide a set of tools that others that people can access, can think about accessing, including that assessment of child friendliness that has been used in a whole variety of countries, including South Africa, to try to address those issues. And I'll stop again now so other people have time.
Great, thank you, David. Further comments?
Hey, Camila?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think that advocacy and discussion and dialogue is very important, and the tool like the peer that provides a description of approaches to inclusion in different countries is really fundamental to learn from other countries. In fact, we know that over time, really what has championed the issue of inclusion has been the issue of people working for disability organization and championing their rights to inclusive education. However, we have seen that really too often still now that we talk about that, we are committed to the principle of inclusive education, there are still too many people that interpret inclusion as something that is for people with disabilities. And I think that really the country, when we talk about sharing expertise and resources, it's really something that is fundamental. And many countries that is going beyond the multi-sectoral approach, is really the multi-actors that is very important, and the fact that there are many areas to tackle in. There is there is the issue of it's really not just about one group, it's really to understand better and to continue to disseminate and learn about what countries have been doing. There is a kind of example that we have proposed in the report because it has changed completely the way to see inclusion in very short time, is Portugal. When they have publish or issue their inclusive education law, they really means all. But they have not looked at single parts of the education system. They have really, to prepare this law, they have invited, they have involved all the actors. And that's really something that is fundamental. So to have a dialogue, to understand better, to continue to advocate, and to realize that it is not yet enough of what's going on, and a piecemeal approach to inclusion is not sufficient.
Great, thank you, Anna. Connie, just before you go, if you haven't gone yet, do you want to just final word or comment?
Sure. I first of all, thank you for including us in this conversation. I feel as if we're always just starting conversations and we never get to dig in deep enough. I would welcome opportunities to share some of the experiences that we are having at a country level with our member organizations in more detail. And I would just, I think, underline the point that Anna's making, that it's not sufficient to be thinking about individual disability groups or individual or different kinds of excluded learners, disability or others. However, the challenge we always have from an advocacy point of view is when we start to contribute to a discussion about broad system change, we tend to be left out once the conversation starts. Right. So it's this balance. There's a bit of a paradox in the most excluded groups being able to contribute to a frame that is bigger than our particular group without being left out of that once it starts to happen. So that's I guess that would be my parting message, that finding ways to, and I think the GEM report really provides a pathway for balancing those.
Great, thank you, Connie. Comments, Kate? Any final thoughts? Maybe need to click on your mic. I haven't seen.
I do, yes. I think technical problems for everybody are just the order of the day from now on, and we just can all be patient with each other in the spirit of inclusive education. Yeah, no, I would really underline what Connie has just said, that inclusive education, if it becomes about any one particular excluded group, I think it very quickly descends into the zero-sum game conversation. But if we are not inclusive about how we begin the policy discussions, people get left out, and the universal design does not come into the equation. And so I think it's fantastic to have this forum. I think you had asked earlier about what UN organizations and agencies might be able to do to be supportive. And I think one of the things that they could do is to continue such collaborative forums. As our definition of who is a vulnerable learner changes due to COVID-19 and climate crisis, or sadly expands, I think coordination among the different UN agencies will become increasingly important, simply because their programs touch such a large group of learners and such a diverse group of learners.
Okay, I think that's a good place where we can maybe pause for how we figure out what next steps might look like. I do need to talk a little bit about the Fresh Partners. Fresh Partners in the past have been traditionally focused on some of the other barriers that exclude students from school around food, hunger and poverty and sanitation and disease, and getting past those really physical and other barriers that are primary or fundamental. And the project that has prompted us to hold this session is one that's actually quite a narrow focus. It's on it's actually about preventing violent extremism, and we broadened it out to students who may be dropping out of school silently, not the ones who are into bullying or discriminating or those kinds of negative antisocial behaviors, which are being addressed by other frameworks such as anti-racism education and anti-bullying education and so on. We could have had more frameworks here, but as we work through the issue of the young people are more vulnerable to being alienated and isolated, we realized that there was a real wealth of knowledge that is captured in many of the panel presentations today. And so maybe the next steps might be trying to figure out how we might share in an ongoing way, because the report that we're working, it's a Public Safety Canada project that has enabled us to look at inclusion quite broadly, and we've taken our typical multi-intervention framework approach to it, sort of coordinating interventions. That's our training. My training from health promotion is that there's so much that we can learn from each other, and then there is so much that countries can learn from the people who are on the line today and others, in offering some sort of ongoing easy way for countries or policymakers to access the wide breadth of knowledge that has been shared today. So maybe we can look at trying to do something together virtually, and look forward to moving this agenda along, and really look forward to UNESCO, the resource of the databases, the policy database, and others continuing to play the lead on it would be really, really helpful. So maybe we can have a conversation about what are the next best steps. And I thank you again for your patience in the startup. I'm smiling as I say this. I've now, and I don't think I want to learn this lesson, I've now learned you can be two places at once, at least virtually. You can be in two meetings at once, and I don't encourage that because it's very stressful. So thank you again, folks, for being online. The information and the additional resources, please send me any that you have, will be posted on the Fresh Partners website. You can see the link there in the chat box. And thank you again for your excellent presentations. Any final comments from the panel members who want to leave us with one final thought? Anna or any others?
No, you're really, it would be great if you go and play with the education profiles, really, and if you have feedback on how to improve these resources, and also on things that you really need and would not be covered there, and to continue this dialogue will be